Ketogenic diet, technically, is any diet that allows you to be in a state of ketosis. So what does that mean? Basically, that means that there is ketones in your body, in your bloodstream, that your body is using as fuel. The ketogenic diet, when it's a well-formulated whole foods approach, is a very anti-inflammatory diet. And so people with joint pain, people with fibromyalgia, people with Sjogren's syndrome, all of this stuff can find real benefit from it. As long as it's a whole food source, diet, it's like the perfect dental diet because we're not fueling these pathogenic bacteria with refined sugars and carbs. That's like their entire fuel source. And so you just starve them out and you don't get cavities.
Get ready for your unofficial dental hygiene podcast. These are the tales of two hygienists, one East Coast RDH and one West Coast Hygienist. Listen as they tackle the profession of dental hygiene with humor and enthusiasm. Now, please join Michelle Strange and Andrew Johnston as they tell you a tale of two hygienists.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A Tale of Two Hygienists, episode number 327. I'm your host, Andrew Johnston, and happy Wednesday to you all. So this week, we have a great episode featuring Dr. Matt Standridge, and we're talking about the keto diet. If you remember, he was the one that came on earlier this year, and we talked about orthodontics. He did a fantastic job. We got really good feedback from all of you listeners. So we decided we'd bring him back about something a little bit different that we know that he's very passionate about, and he is known as the Ketodontist. And so I think that you're really going to love this. So he was a great guest. Thank him so much for his generosity. And when it comes to something like this, especially dieting and things that are maybe more, I don't want to say opinionated, but like there are facts and there are science on certain topics, but there are plenty of alternatives out there. And I think that, I mentioned last week that it's almost kind of like, the CrossFit people, like, well, CrossFit, I think that we know is really good for a lot of people, but it's not for everybody. And it really takes some courage to put your message out there like this. And so I really thank him for sharing his expertise and his experiences with us. Hopefully it's going to help some of you out there. So be sure to reach out to him if you're looking for a coach or you're wondering how to get started. Next week, we have an episode coming your way about getting patients to want what they need. And that is with Janet Hagerman. So be sure to check that one out. As always, please make sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Make sure you tell your friends about how wonderful Janet Hagerman is, the things that you learned. And Friday, we have a special interview that I think many would find very interesting. So it's that same episode format that we have out every Friday, but a little bit longer this time. But it's with Ann Duffy, and she started DO, which stands for Dental Entrepreneur Woman. And we talk a little bit about that organization and how it helps women to set and achieve their career goals. And so if this is something that you've been feeling it's missing for you, make sure you listen to that episode so that you can learn all the great tips, and then head over to the website, check it out, see if that's something that you want to be a part of. I know many of my friends are part of that organization. In fact, Brittany, who helps us here at the podcast, isn't even a dental professional, but she's a part of the organization as well. And so, we find a lot of value, and I think that you're going to find that too. Don't forget to check out our website, atale2hygienist.com, sign up for the newsletter. And honestly, it's just a really slow news week. So that's all I have for you. So let's get right into it. Enjoy this episode with Dr. Matt Standridge. Welcome back, listeners, to the interview portion of the podcast. I am joined again by Dr. Matt Standridge. Thank you, Doctor, for making time again so quickly after our last one.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's so fun the first time. I figured why not again, huh?
Our audience absolutely loved it too. I know I shared some things with you, but we have gotten more feedback and more downloads on your episode than so many other ones recently.
Awesome.
So I'm like, this is going to be great. It's a great topic we're going to talk about today, and a great guest. So we're going to talk a little bit today about, and this part is maybe not controversial, but is it the keto diet, or is it about keto, or what? How do you talk about even this? Because you're not supposed to do diets, right? It's about lifestyle change and this and that. Yeah. So how do you even say that part?
Right. So, the thing is about the ketogenic diet is there's so many different applications to that. And we can get to it in a little bit. So, I nicknamed myself the Ketodontist, right? And that's kind of my logo. And I didn't come up with that. My wife came up with that, so all credit to her. But anyways, I see it as a baseline. It's what I keep going back to. I don't live it 100% all the time. I'll dip in and out because there was quite a long time when I was very strict keto because I needed to be. I had inflammatory issues and all that stuff. Now I've developed more flexibility in my life. So I see it as a tool in the toolbox. Some people choose to make it their inherent lifestyle. They're in keto 100% of the times, and we can talk about when I think that is applicable and when that's very beneficial. But then others like myself have learned that have developed the metabolic flexibility to where we can drift in and out, and it doesn't make it any discernible difference.
So how do we define, I guess, what is keto?
That's a great question. It always starts off with a clarification of terms, right? So a ketogenic diet, technically, is any diet that allows you to be in a state of ketosis. Well, what does that mean? Basically, that means that there is ketones in your body, in your bloodstream, that your body is using as fuel. Now, ketones got a bad rap decades ago because of uncontrolled diabetics, type 1 and now type 2 diabetics. If they are uncontrolled and all that stuff, there's a metabolic syndrome that is very devastating called ketoacidosis. And so that is when ketones are being measured, and there's it's almost like a free fall of the body. The body is just like producing and flooding the body with these ketones, but it's not necessarily the ketones that's the problem. It's other metabolic systems that are failing. But ketones kind of got the bad rap for it because, high ketones bad. But when we look at what ketone levels are like through dietary means, we're dealing with 15 to 20 times less ketones than somebody in ketoacidosis. So it's just like anything else. Water is good in moderation. Water keeps us alive. Too much water drowns us and kills us. So water's not inherently evil. It's, and so ketones in of itself is a fuel byproduct of fat metabolism. And so just like blood sugar, your body releases blood sugar for energy. Ketosis is a state where your body is producing and releasing ketones that are being used as fuel.
So essentially, when we're getting rid of the carbohydrates, which our body normally would be using or not ingesting them,
right,
then our body has to find a different way to create the fuel that needs to keep going.
Exactly. So it's an alternative fuel source for the body to blood glucose. It's blood ketones. And there are decent amount of studies nowadays that show that certain tissues, like certain cells in the heart, it almost seems like they preferentially burn ketones over glucose. Like it's a better fuel source for certain tissues. And so it's kind of interesting with the science that's come along. But yeah, basically it's an alternative fuel source that is being derived from fat so at the most stripped down fundamental level, it's asking a person, do you want to be a sugar burner or do you want to be a fat burner? And if you have a lot of extra body fat, it may be beneficial to, you tap into that and use that as a fuel source.
So I do want to come back to like body types here in just a little bit of who should do what, but I feel like anyone that I've ever seen on the ketogenic diet, I feel like is so hard. They just eat meat all day long. Right. I feel like that's like the mentality that everyone thinks about is we're eating fats, we're eating proteins.
Cheeseburgers. Yeah, it's bacon cheeseburgers all day, every day, right? Yeah.
I mean, but I feel like can that really be good for you?
Right.
Eating that way.
Right. Yeah, and so that's again where some of the nuance comes into play, because there's so many different ways to do quote unquote keto, because technically a keto diet is any diet that is low enough in carbohydrates where you produce blood ketones and they're measurable. any diet can do that. And so, like, that could be a diet of bologna and, potted meat and Velveeta cheese, or it could be a Cobb salad, with some ranch dressing in moderation. Both of those are perfectly keto meals, but which one sounds healthier? Like which one's going to, serve your body better, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's where keto kind of gets a bad rap, because you have these people who are basically, making a plate of bacon, smother it in mayo and wrapping it in cheese and calling it keto. It's like, yeah, it
And then they take a
might not be
picture
the
and they put it on their
best.
profile and they're like, hey, I'm
Exactly.
doing keto.
There's this one, and one of the things, just get off a tangent here, because TikTok influencers are all the rage and all that
Of
stuff.
course.
And there's this keto TikTok influencer who, for a snack, was literally, or for a meal, was literally taking a block of cream cheese, sprinkling it with everything but the bagel seasoning, and then eating it. And that's supposedly a meal. And I'm just
Oh,
like, what are you doing? This is insane.
this is why we have a bad reputation.
Exactly.
Is there a certain percentage or like a percentage of your intake or certain grams of carbohydrates that everyone
Right.
needs, or is it based on kind of like your body mass?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Some people, depending on if, what their body fat percentage is like, depending on what type of activity that they're doing, there are some people that are going to benefit from having carbs. No doubt about it. But unless if you're a strenuous athlete, most of us aren't Olympic athletes.
No.
And so most of us are eating enough carbohydrates that if we were Olympic athletes, it would make sense. But
Hmm.
most of us aren't that. But we're eating like we are. Like, we're eating that amount of carbohydrates and stuff. So, as far as essential carbohydrates, there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Like, you could actually, a person could live cradle to grave as long as their protein and fats and trace minerals, vitamins and minerals are on point. A person could live cradle from grave without eating carbohydrates,
Interesting.
because our body needs glucose. But there is a process called gluconeogenesis that happens where substrates from either fat or protein or both are converted and broken down into glucose, so our body can make its own glucose as long as we're getting enough protein and fat. So there's no dietary need for carbohydrates. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing to have carbs, but
Mhm.
it's just like the quote unquote need just actually isn't a thing as long as those other things are being taken care of.
I feel like in some diets there needs to be supplementation, like just
Mm-hmm.
you talk about trace minerals, making sure that we get our trace minerals.
Mm-hmm.
Is this normal in the ketogenic diet to also take supplements to get those?
You know, one of the reasons that almost every diet now, for a whole laundry list of reasons, most every diet needs supplementation nowadays, because our soil has been robbed from nutrients. The food that we grow just don't have as much nutrients built in them as we did 50 or 100 years ago,
Mhm.
um, and stuff like that. So almost every diet needs supplementation of some point. Ideally not, but the way that our food system is set up now, it pretty much is a given. But some diets are more needed for supplementation, like vegans, for example,
Right.
have a very hard time with B12. They have to really be on point with supplementing B12, because that is a B vitamin that is found highly in animal products, but not really found a whole lot in as high in amounts in plant sources. So that's an example of a diet that does need supplementation, and also getting the right amino acid profile, so protein, getting the right, all of the little protein building blocks, getting everything that you need can be harder on a vegan diet, because
Hmm.
animal proteins, meat, has an already complete amino profile built into it, versus plants. Some plants will be higher in these amino acids, but have barely none of these others. And there's like 22 amino acids. So they have to play kind of a protein Tetris to make sure that they're getting all the building blocks that they need. Totally doable, but it does take some mindfulness, and so you really got to kind of know what you're doing to get there. With keto, as long as it's whole foods based keto, nothing is really needed much more than basically a quality multivitamin. And one thing that we have to take when not even just keto, but low carb in general, is you have to really make sure that your electrolytes are on point. Sodium, potassium, magnesium. That is the only thing that I really have to quote unquote supplement with. Because again, most people are getting their electrolytes, mainly sodium, through packaged processed foods. All these processed foods are high in salt, right? And so what happens is when we remove that from our diet, our salt intake goes down quite considerably when we're eating a whole foods diet. And meat doesn't have as much salt anymore through processing and all that stuff, unless if it's, like sausage or bacon, something that's a little bit more processed. But nowadays, what happens is when we drop our carbs, our basal insulin levels go down. And with that, we excrete water. With that water goes salt stores as well. And so when you hear people talk about keto flu or low carb flu or whatever, a lot of times that's actually due to low electrolytes. They feel fatigued, they feel lightheaded, all that stuff. And we used to think it was just kind of a rite of passage that your body's just getting used to burning fat. But now we know better, and it's actually, 95% of the time it's due to low electrolytes. And so if I have to supplement anything, it's just making sure I get enough salt in my diet.
But how do you supplement that? It's not like you just take a spoonful of salt and just shove it down.
You can, or you can use bouillon. There are also electrolyte products like this. Obviously, I keep this in my office. It's called Element, LMNT. And it's a salt mix. Each packet has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. And so that's what I like to do, and I also like to salt my foods. And I also make like bouillon or chicken broth or beef broth, and I'll get my salt in that way. So those are kind of the ways that I keep up on my salt intake. And I've been doing it long enough now that I don't have any issues. I don't actually have to salt my food as much. But when people are first starting, they really got to be mindful of it, because as they excrete that water, because that insulin levels go down, and that creates a trigger to the kidneys to start, just flushing water. So then with that goes our salt stores. And so people just starting off really have to be mindful of it. But now I pay hardly any attention to it.
Did I see this morning that you had like the best part of like waking up was bone broth or something?
Yeah, exactly. That's my quote unquote breakfast is usually bouillon, or I make my homemade bone broth about once every other week or so. We'll get for dinner. If my wife is in a hurry and when she's going shopping for dinner, she'll just go to like Walmart, for example, and you know how they have those whole rotisserie chickens right there. And stuff. And that's pretty good, because that plus a couple bags of frozen veggies, you can feed a family of 4 for under $10. So it's a really good, nutritious meal. And what I do is I take that carcass, I put it in the Instapot, add water, some seasonings, and some bouillon cubes. I just let that cook down even more, and it creates a very cheap but nutritious bone broth that I'll use.
Do you feel like following this has made you quite the cook, quite the adventurous?
I've always, I grew up, I tended to growing up from my single mom for a good chunk of my life, and she's an excellent cook. So I got to kind of learn from her. So I actually I'd already kind of knew my way around the kitchen. I just learned how to modify it from going from just like the standard American diet to all this other stuff.
So I have a couple more kind of, not rapid fire questions necessarily, but like I think the basics of ketogenic diet. Alcohol. Is alcohol contraindicated?
Well, alcohol technically is always going to be contraindicated, right? Like there's no like
There's no medicinal
healthy,
value for that.
healthy
Right,
amount
exactly.
of alcohol. It's just, what's going to be a little bit bad versus very bad, right?
Yeah.
But you can still be keto, and I did that. You just have to stay away from sugar. So you're kind of more like vodkas. You're more like spirit type stuff, and not sweetened, not like vanilla rum. You have to drink regular rum, not
Right.
not appletinis. You have to drink regular
Yeah.
regular vodka. But you'd stick to your hard spirits, or even some of the new like hard seltzers have zero sugar and stuff. But the thing is about alcohol, if you're trying to lose weight, it's a slippery slope because alcohol in of itself is not fattening. And what I mean by that is that your body cannot store alcohol. It cannot convert it to fat. If you eat excess calories in any other of the other macronutrients, it has mechanisms to store the excess as fat. Alcohol is not like that. Alcohol, you can't store it. And that's actually what makes it toxic, is because you can't store it. And so your body has to get rid of it. So technically, alcohol will not fatten you up. However, any food that you have in your stomach, any digestion that's going on, your body is basically going to halt that and stop using it for energy. And so if it's not using that for energy, it's getting converted to fat.
Mm.
So and also most people don't drink alcohol just by itself on an empty stomach. They're usually having it with a meal or something
Sure.
like that. If they have too much alcohol, their inhibitions go down, and then they really hit up the pub food and all that stuff, like the most fried, worst food for you. And all of that, if alcohol is in your system, you can almost guarantee all of that is going to be stored as fat, because your body is too busy burning the alcohol. It has to, because it has no storage mechanism for it. So it has to burn it. And that's why we get drunk, is because all these other systems start shutting down. And that's where we get kind of the buzz and the loopiness feel of it, is because the body is having to focus on burning through this alcohol and using it as energy. And so all these other processes just kind of get put on standby.
That's probably the best explanation I've ever heard of that. Good job, doctor. So sometimes I feel like when you switch to a high protein diet, kidney stones are an issue. Is that something that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so uric acid is a concern, but we don't find that as big of an issue when we drop the carbs concurrently.
Okay.
I see that more of an issue when we have high protein, high fat, and high carbs all together, right? And so, especially high carb, high fat, that's when we start getting more gallstones and stuff like that. High protein diets, when linked with kind of lower carbohydrate, just haven't shown to have that effect as much. And more research shows that we used to be kind of concerned with high protein diets as far as like kidney disease and stuff like that, renal failure and stuff. But now with the latest science that's coming out, it shows that that's not really a non-issue, as long as we're not in an overfed hypercaloric state. And the number one reason that most of us are in a hypercaloric state is because we're eating foods that are too calorie dense and often have a high combination of both carbohydrates and fat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are the expectations for weight loss? And is this really intended to be a weight loss mechanism?
Right. So it certainly can be a weight loss mechanism. Now, the thing is, and one thing that I try to explain to folks, and on social media and through my Ketodontist podcast and stuff like that, when I have time to do it, is explaining, because there's a lot of folks who say that you have to be keto in order to lose weight, but that's certainly not true. Technically, any diet that is going to be in a caloric deficit, you can lose fat on. And we've seen that. We've seen people on The Biggest Loser who were on higher carb, lower fats diets, and they lost fat, right? And so a ketogenic diet has been kind of a few years ago was made to be like this secret fat loss tool. Now, it can certainly be beneficial for fat loss, but people can also gain weight on a ketogenic diet if their calories are out of control. And so it's not inherently magical. There's just certain benefits that people can have that make it worth it to them.
Sure.
So a ketogenic diet, when it's a well-formulated whole foods approach, is a very anti-inflammatory diet. And so, people with joint pain, people with fibromyalgia, people with Sjogren's syndrome, all of this stuff can find real benefit from it. And so people who are needing to lose weight, maybe they're type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic or whatever, and they have all these inflammatory issues, a ketogenic diet can be a very, very effective way to not only lose weight, but help address some of these inflammatory issues. And as you address some of these inflammatory issues, then they're going to be more prone to want to take a walk or maybe hit the gym and stuff like that, right? So it kind of creates this snowball effect of wellness versus somebody who is dealing with these inflammatory issues and they're trying to lose weight on maybe like a higher carb diet full of possibly inflammatory stuff like grains and sugars that might be triggering their inflammation. And they're not going to really feel like walking. They're going to be sore all the time. Their joints are going to be on fire. And so, that's where I think a ketogenic diet can be very beneficial for folks, especially, like I said, if they're diabetic or pre-diabetic, because obviously they have blood sugar issues. Well, how about making a diet where you just don't introduce a whole lot of sugar into your bloodstream? It's like if your pipe bursts down in your basement, your basement's flooding. Do you want to, just let it let the pipe keep running, and you're just down there trying to, with a mop and bucket and trying to just get it out sooner, quicker than the basement's filling up? Or do you want to just maybe shut the water off? Exactly. And then address the issue. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the way that I view it, is like, if we have blood sugar issues, if we have all this, our hemoglobin A1C's through the roof, well, there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. So let's just adopt a diet that doesn't jack our blood sugar up, and let's start bringing that down, and then eventually like reverse making our fuel source more fat derived, and just kind of going from there, if that makes sense.
And I feel like that reduction in inflammation would probably translate in the mouth too. Like we're dental professionals. That's what we would see, right? Mm-hmm. It would continue on.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Well, so for an example, myself, I find that if I have, and I've kind of measured this by myself, I think I have pretty good home care. I use a water pick. I know how to brush. I walk the walk. And yet, if I start having over about 100, 120 grams of total carbohydrates a day, and I'm doing that routinely, I start getting gingivitis, even though nothing else has changed in my home care. Now, I don't know the true mechanistic action of that because it hasn't been studied as far as my knowledge. So maybe it's just the increase in carbohydrates is letting the bacteria build faster, because for cavities, for example, any cavity causing bacteria uses carbohydrates as a fuel source. Mm-hmm. Any fermentable carbohydrate it uses as a fuel source. And plaque, for example, is the biofilm is a lattice network of glucans and fructans. Those are substructures built from glucose and fructose molecules. And so is it maybe that just me consuming that more, it just gives those bacteria more substrate and more building blocks for the plaque and all that stuff, and that's sitting there and causing the gingivitis? Or is there something inherently systematically more inflammatory going on, and it's showing up in the gums?
I mean, it could be a little bit of both, right?
It could be both.
More susceptible systemically, right. And then because of that lattice structure you're talking about, yeah, I mean, it could be all of those things. Kind of while we're on the oral systemic, just I don't know if you've seen this or heard about this. I feel like I watched this one movie or documentary once that they were studying, I want to say it was epilepsy,
Mm-hmm.
and it was with kids, and they put the kids
Mm-hmm.
on a ketogenic diet,
Yep.
and it wasn't like, look, we're not saying that's going to solve epilepsy, but like,
Right.
I feel like they were using that as a piece of the structure of the home life and
Yeah.
seeing the responses and what was that all about? And I feel like ADHD too.
Yeah, so I actually don't know about the ADHD one, but the epilepsy thing, yeah, that started. I think it was in John Hopkins Hospital back in maybe the 50s, and there's been a whole thing. If you Google the Charlie Foundation, there was epilepsy can be very well regulated. I actually know quite a few epileptics that through a ketogenic diet have been seizure free for years.
Oh.
And they're on a minuscule medications and stuff like that. And so it can be a very powerful thing because the brain can use ketones as fuel.
Hmm.
About 25% of the brain's energy need to come from glucose, but again, we can produce our own glucose. But it can also use ketones for fuel. And with that coupled with the kind of anti-inflammatory effects within reason, see something in that mechanism, and I don't know it for sure because that's stepping outside of my bounds, but has been shown to be very beneficial for folks with epilepsy.
Hmm. All right, jumping back into kind of bigger picture. Some diets, I feel like, when you don't have the energy and all of these things, they also tell you, oh, by the way, because your caloric intake is low, don't work out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't go on long strenuous walks. You can't do all of
Right.
these things. So what does that look like? Can you lift weights? Can you do all of those
Mm-hmm.
things
Yeah.
on a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are certain activities that the body will do better with carbs. So Olympic sprinters, for example, there's different pathways of energy use. There's glycolytic pathways, meaning the preferred fuel is glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, right?
Mm.
So glycogen is stored in the muscles, it's stored in the liver, and stuff like that. So highly glycolytic activities like sprinting seem to do better with being fueled by carbs.
Mm.
But other activities, even sprinting, honestly, you can adopt your body to learn how to use fat as energy. The thing is, most of us, if we've been eating carbs all of our life, our bodies haven't had to use the metabolic machinery that it takes to use fat as a fuel source. And so people, if you're just real new to this, yeah, you might not be able to run a marathon, right away.
Yeah.
But with time and with training, you absolutely can. Like, Sammy, I'm trying to remember his last name. Him and his wife did something pretty incredible. They did this thing called Fat Chance Row. And so Sammy was a triathlete, like a borderline professional triathlete. And so he was doing Ironmans and all that stuff.
Mm.
And he is a fit looking dude. He's like Swedish and he has this like combed over hair and he's like perfect. And yet over the years of all this endurance training, his metabolic, he was developing basically diabetes. His blood sugar was through the roof. His A1C's through the roof. So here's this guy who eats amazing. He exercises tons, and yet he's becoming more and more diabetic. So that's when he learned about kind of low carbohydrate training and stuff like that. He learned of some science through some doctors, Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek, who wrote a book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, and they wrote a sports performance book called Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. And they showed a lot of the science, a lot of studies that they had done on endurance athletes and benefits coming to them as they adopted more of a low carbohydrate lifestyle and their bodies learned to use fat as a fuel source. Because, so like, for example, somebody with average body fat, maybe like 20% body fat. I'm way over that. But so somebody with 20% body fat, they maybe have about 2,500 calories worth of glycogen fuel stored in their body through muscle and through liver. They maybe have 2,500 to 3,000 calories of glycogen storage. But they have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of calories worth of fuel storage in body fat. And so going keto, going low carb is all about having the body learn how to tap into that fuel source and, not have to go through glycogen. So for endurance athletes, for example, if you've ever seen like footage of marathons and like starting around mile 22, people's bodies just like shut down. Like they just stop and like drop. They can't, all of a sudden they're like crawling and they can't see straight and all that stuff. It's a term in endurance sports called bonking or hitting the wall. And that is literally they have been fueling with their bodies are sugar burners and they've run out of sugar. They literally have no fuel that they can use. And so they just hit this wall and they basically collapse. And so that's why endurance athletes are sugar burners. They have to eat these gel packs and, drink Gatorade and all this stuff constantly because they're doing all this caloric demand, but their body can only hold a day's worth of calories and glycogen. Whereas you have people that learn how to use their body's own fat sources as fuel, and they have an unlimited supply of energy as long as they get enough protein and like minerals and stuff, building blocks. And so you look at people like I was talking about, that Sammy, him and his wife trained low carb. And what they did to test if you really need carbs to fuel your body is they took a 2-person rowboat and they rowed all the way from Los Angeles to Hawaii, unassisted. Like nobody following them. They were recording it by themselves and all they had were like freeze-dried pack of keto meals and stuff. And that's what they subsisted on. And they actually broke the previous record of doing that. They broke it by like days, or maybe even they broke it like by 2 or 3 days. And so not only were they eating no carbs, but they were able to do so, look good when they got off the boat, as good as you can look, when you're out rowing at sea for, a few weeks, but like, they still look strong. They didn't look like fragile or near half dead, and they broke the previous record doing so. So that right there showed me, okay, you don't really need carbs, to be active. And then you look at people like Zach Bitter, who's an endurance athlete who runs like a 50K, like an ultra marathon, and breaking records, and he's ketogenic. And so it's just, it really opened my eyes to, what's possible.
Yeah. I was at, our listeners, unfortunately, have heard this story a time or two, but I was at Europerio back in 2017, 2018, whenever the last one was. They had a course on there about these endurance athletes and the gel packs that they have and the effect on it it's Europerio, so it's about their periodontium, but also their decay rates are just through the roof, right?
Yep.
So anyways, that's just an little side bit there. It was one of the most fascinating courses I've ever taken. Finally, we've done dentistry and sports. I'm like, okay, this is where it's at.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things that brings me to a low carb or ketogenic diet anyway, is because dentally, as long as it's a whole food source, diet, it's like the perfect dental diet because we're not fueling these pathogenic bacteria with refined sugars and carbs. That's like their entire fuel source. And so you just starve them out and you don't get cavities. It's just like, it's really that fundamental. And if you go and look at like in dentistry, Weston A. Price has kind of a weird, how do I want to say, reputation. But back in the day when he was like head scientific chairman of the ADA when he was a practicing dentist back in the 40s and 50s. So for his time, he was like the leading edge of dental science. And when he went around the world, because he's working in the States, and he's like, why is this happening? Why are all my patients getting cavities? So he goes around the world and goes to all these indigenous areas that haven't been touched by the Western food supply. And so they don't have refined sugars, they don't have refined flours and grains and stuff like that. He goes to the Alps, he goes to the Inuit up in Antarctica, he goes through to some different islands. And all of these tribes and all these different places, they in areas that they didn't have refined sugar or flours, hardly any cavities. Yeah. And the Inuit, they had virtually no cavities. Like some of the Alps and stuff, when they made their own bread and stuff like that, they would still have some cavities. It's dramatically lower than here in the States. But like the Inuit, even compared to the people in the Alps, had 1,500 times less cavities than the people in the Alps. I mean, it was virtually non-existent because they had zero carbohydrate diets.
It's incredible.
Not saying that we all have to be zero carbohydrate, but like that's literally, as far as evidence-based medicine goes, if you want a cavity-free diet, it would be a zero carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So the unfortunate part is there's no way that, like, how long have you been studying all this? Years and years and years?
Yeah. So I've had experience with low carb and keto for about 20 years. And that was for my own weight loss in high school, but I've really been intensely reading, like actually reading books, reading papers, talking to authors of the papers and stuff for about 7 years now.
Yeah. And there's no way that we can contain all of that in one little 45-minute podcast. So right. I guess like the last thing I'd love for you to talk to the audience about is, getting started, but also the importance of a coach, like in coaching and what that entails.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is finding a support structure. And for me, it's accountability. Like myself, I need accountability. And so even though I coach people on it, I also have my own coach because I need somebody to hold me accountable as well. But accountability is a big factor, but also finding someone who knows what they're doing. Because there's a lot of people who might read a book or listen to a podcast and think that they know everything. And you really have to have someone who knows the nuance. Like, I would say less than half of my people that I coach for weight loss and body recomposition and stuff like that, less than half the people are ketogenic. I give them the option. Do you want to be keto? And if they're type 2 diabetic and stuff, I'll tell them if I see benefit of doing so, but I don't push it. I let them decide. But as far as first things first is knowing a person who knows how to structure calories, how to structure protein where that needs to be for effective levels, and then knowing how to titrate carbohydrates and fat depending on what the person's wanting to do. Mm-hmm. If they're wanting to gain weight, if they're wanting to lose weight, what type of activity they're going to be doing and stuff like that. So that's one of the biggest important things is just not necessarily finding someone who, preaches keto, but knows the nuances, knows when it might not be the best thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If someone wanted to reach out for you for more information, maybe listen to your podcast, where can they find you and where can they find the podcast?
Yeah, so podcast is basically everywhere you listen to podcasts. So it's on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, all that stuff. And my website is Ketodontist.com, so Ketodontist. Also, my email is ketodontist@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. I'm actually at Dr. Matthew Standridge, Dr. Matthew Standridge, but pretty easy to get a hold of or track down and stuff. And I'm always just I'm always trying to put stuff out there, always trying to put out information, either a new study that I find out, or if it's a little bit of myth busting, or sharing just my personal experience of how I do things. And so just constantly trying to put stuff out there, and maybe, just either garner interest for people, or just even little nuggets that they can take away for themselves.
Well, I appreciate that you do that, because I think, you're one of the people I look to for my own personal goals and journeys. Like I've talked a little bit in the past about, kind of my struggles, and, it's nice to know that there's other people that are putting good evidence, good research, good information out there, that even if I'm not ready in my journey yet, or, I'm past ready or whatever, that
Right.
I can consume that and kind of keep that front of mind,
Exactly.
so that I'll be prepared for that day. So
Yeah.
Dr. Standridge, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic as always. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.